Ever wonder why people forget what they're talking about while high? And are you worried that that's going to continue to last after you stop smoking? So today I will explain the how and why of our memory problems on weed. So there are two types of effects here. You have the effects while you're actually on the drug, and then you have the effects after taking it for a long period of time. And let me explain what we know about both according to science. So first, what are the effects when you're just under the influence? So what we see is that THC actually kind of impairs what is known as our working memory. So our working memory is our ability to kind of hold information in our brain at any point in time and kind of manipulate it. So doing things like being able to follow directions. So this kind of explains why people forget what they're actively talking about. So you are thinking about what you're doing at the moment, but you're also participating in a conversation. And if you're speaking, that's a lot of things going on. And so THC might impair that ability to remember everything that's happening at the same time. We also see that THC causes problems with things like declarative memory, specifically our ability to remember like verbal free recall. So if you're given like a long list of words, how many of those can you remember? That's verbal free recall, and what we see is that the drug actually impairs that. We also see that it could actually increase your ability to have false memories. And we've seen this in actually a couple of paradigms. So there's something known as the DRM, the Dice Rodinger McDermott paradigm, where you basically just have people memorize a list of words, and then there's this word that is not on the list, but definitely related to all the rest of them. So the word that's not on the list will be bread, and all the rest of those words are things like rye and sandwich and dough and loaf. And so you are more likely to remember that word bread, not on the list, but very related to it, if you had just smoked or used THC. And in an eyewitness paradigm, so when they made people like watch a video of something happening, they were far more likely to make up fake details or to believe suggested details. So THC actually seems to be increasing the likelihood that somebody's going to have a false memory. This is all while you are actually under the influence, though. So what happens after chronic use? And this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So there's not as much good evidence that there are long-term irreversible impairments from weed. Note the word irreversible here. So we do see that there are deficits if people use weed for a long period of time. They will have kind of long-term memory impairments, but those impairments might go away. So there are studies that looked at chronic users, and what they found is that after using for a period of time, they had those memory impairments, but then that would slowly fade away, and after like a month, it was basically gone. Now, they said that heavy users, which in this case had a very strange criterion of smoking over 94 joints a week, like who decided on that specific level? But anyways, if they were heavy smokers, those impairments were still seen a month afterwards. But like 94 joints a week. And that's actually one of the like big problems with these studies, is that there's not really like a good definition that everyone uses of different types of users. So heavy users versus moderate users. Like, do you use non-smokers as a control group? Do you use people who have never smoked? How are you differentiating between these groups? And since there isn't really a definition, it's really hard to actually kind of pull all of this evidence together and see what it is attempting to say. We have some evidence that says like this might be more of a long-term problem if somebody started earlier. It might be linked to frequency, but it depends on how you define frequency, for example. It's all sorts of a mess. Then you kind of have like these weird things that show up, like people who are heavy smokers might actually develop tolerance to the kind of acute memory problem. So remember how I was saying earlier that like THC causes impairment of working memory? So you have problems with your short-term memory while you're actually on it? Yeah, that might be true for people who are rare smokers, but it is seemingly not that true for heavy smokers. So they actually develop a tolerance to that impairment and are thus less impaired when they smoke. But like in that study, they were saying that it was only for a heavy dose of THC, which by the way, they defined as anything more than 3.9% in one single joint. 3.9% is not that much THC, y'all. So how does this all work? Like, why is it actually causing a memory impairment? And what we see is that it is because THC is working on CB1 receptors, which are basically all over your brain. This is actually one of the reasons why it is so difficult to create new medications based off of our endocannabinoid system. So basically the natural cannabinoids that we have in our brain. It's because we have so many receptors in so many places. And when you affect those receptors, it affects those receptors all over. So like the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, things like the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, it's affecting those areas, and those areas are strongly linked to memory. So since there are receptors everywhere, it is affecting all of those different systems. And this is also why it makes like people feel like they have to eat, because it is affecting those receptors in the hypothalamus, the area that helps with like our feeding behavior. It is just doing all sorts of things to all sorts of different areas of our brain. And we do see that this system is particularly sensitive during developmental periods of time. So that might explain why adolescents might be more sensitive to this, or why early onset of this might cause more memory impairment. Now, unsurprisingly, when it comes to any of this type of research, we don't have as much as we need on it. So this is more of we have this anecdotal situation. People report that there are these effects, and we've done some of the initial studies, but we need to dive into this far more, which I will say as a cannabinoid researcher is very difficult to do when this drug is still Schedule 1 and almost impossible to do research on. Just put